The stink of rotting flesh clung to the royal palace like a curse, whispering of unspeakable appetites and perversions that even centuries of Spanish silence could not wash away. In the shadowed chambers of the Bourbon dynasty, one man's twisted hunger for pleasure and power left a stain that Spain has tried desperately to forget. His name was Ferdinand VII, a monarch whose vile excesses and grotesque cruelty earned him the title that dared not be spoken aloud, the royal pervert. In the early decades of the 19th century, Spain was a kingdom battered by war, revolution, and humiliations at the hands of Napoleon's armies. Into this chaos returned Ferdinand VII, once a symbol of hope for a people weary of foreign domination, who had spent years in French captivity. To the common Spaniard, Ferdinand was the lost prince who would restore a golden age, but what came back from France was no redeemer. He was a tyrant draped in royal robes, hiding appetites that would shock even the libertines of Versailles. Born in 1784 to King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, Ferdinand was a child twisted by fear, jealousy, and a desperate thirst for validation. Even as a boy, he watched his mother's rumored affairs and his father's cowardly passivity with a festering disgust. Court gossip churned with whispers of Queen Maria Luisa's liaisons with her power-hungry favorite, Manuel Godoy, a man who rose from the rank of bodyguard to virtual ruler of Spain. In these poisonous corridors, Ferdinand learned the language of manipulation, of lust, and of betrayal. By 1808, the Spanish people had grown sick of Godoy's corrupt regency and Charles IV's weakness, rising in fury against them. Ferdinand, seizing the moment, plotted with a band of conspirators to overthrow his own parents. And so the boy who had grown up nursing his resentments snatched the throne only to be caught in the jaws of Napoleon Bonaparte, who saw in Spain's turmoil the perfect excuse to expand his empire. Ferdinand was captured and shipped off to the French palace of Valenciennes, where the emperor toyed with him like a cat with a rat. But captivity only blackened Ferdinand's soul further. Years in Valenciennes seemed to feed his bitterness and twist his mind. Surrounded by French luxury, denied true power, Ferdinand sank into fantasies of total control, plotting endlessly to reclaim his kingdom and avenge every humiliation he had ever suffered. When Napoleon was finally forced to release him in 1813, Ferdinand returned to Spain not as a wise or forgiving monarch, but as a predator in regal flesh, eager to punish a nation that had dared to survive without him. Spain greeted Ferdinand as a savior, delirious with hope that he would restore order after the chaos of the French invasion. The fanfare was thunderous, peasants kissed his boots, nobles wept at the sight of him, and church bells rang for days. But within weeks, the mask of benevolence cracked. Ferdinand revoked the liberal constitution of 1812, which had promised rights and freedoms to the Spanish people, and declared himself an absolute monarch. He unleashed a wave of repression against liberals, patriots, and anyone who had resisted the French, ironically the very people who had saved Spain from Napoleon. Yet it was not merely Ferdinand's politics that made him a dark figure in Spanish history. Rumors began to swirl of his depraved private life, of countless young girls brought to his bed, of humiliations and cruelties that even the court chroniclers dared only hint at in coded language. His marriages became a grotesque theater of power and lust. Ferdinand's 4 wives, Maria Antonia of Naples, Maria Isabel of Portugal, Maria Josepha, Amalia of Saxony, and Maria Christina of the 2 Sicilies, suffered through his twisted demands, miscarriages, forced conjugal humiliations, and a constant terror of falling out of favor. His obsession with securing an heir became a morbid fixation. He was known to summon midwives and physicians to inspect his wives in the most humiliating ways, demanding detailed accounts of their bodies and fertility. When they failed to give him a surviving son, he erupted in rages so violent that one queen reportedly feared she would be strangled in her sleep. Ferdinand's insatiable desire to dominate both his people and his women bordered on the monstrous, earning him the whispered label of El Pervertido Real, the royal pervert. He built a network of spies to monitor not only his court, but the bedrooms of his nobles, hungry to expose rivals or satisfy a voyeuristic fascination with other people's secrets. Reports suggest that he sometimes forced nobles to witness his own displays of power over his queens, as if humiliating them publicly could confirm his absolute control. Such stories were almost too horrifying to record, and historians even today struggle to separate fact from rumor. Yet the consistency of these tales across sources reveals a pattern. Ferdinand VII was a man who believed everything and everyone in Spain, from the highest bishop to the youngest maiden, existed purely for his pleasure. Spain would pay dearly for the reign of this monstrous sovereign. In the next chapter of Ferdinand's story, we will see how his paranoia and perversions twisted the kingdom into a landscape of fear, how the liberal hopes of an entire nation were suffocated by a single man's unquenchable hunger for control, and how the royal pervert's shadow still stains the pages of Spanish history. As Ferdinand VII settled once more onto the Spanish throne, the hopes of his people began to rot like overripe fruit under a pitiless sun. What had begun with parades and triumphant cheers quickly dissolved into a reign of repression, driven by the king's deranged insecurities and lust for absolute power. The Constitution of 1812, a remarkable liberal achievement inspired by the revolutionary movements of Europe, had promised Spaniards freedom of the press, property rights, and representation. Ferdinand tore it to pieces without hesitation, branding its authors, traitors, and criminals. Spain became a kingdom held hostage by its own monarch. Ferdinand re-established the Inquisition, though under a new name to hunt down dissenters. Priests and bishops loyal to him publicly denounced liberals as heretics, while secret police scoured towns for those who had supported the Cortes of Cadiz. Jails overflowed, and gallows were raised in town squares. Entire families were ruined for a whispered insult, a half-burned pamphlet, or a neighbor's casual betrayal. The king's regime festered with spies and paid informants, eager to feed Ferdinand's morbid curiosity about those who might threaten him. And in his private chambers, the horror was worse still. Ferdinand, ever obsessed with his lineage and haunted by the fear of dying childless, demanded that his queens undergo invasive examinations by doctors he trusted, sometimes in front of witnesses, to verify their integrity and their ability to bear him sons. If the results did not please him, he erupted in cruel fits of rage, berating his queens with filthy language and striking them. The terror of these moments left deep scars on every woman who tried to love him, or at least survive him. Maria Antonia, his first wife, was a gentle and bright princess from Naples. She arrived in Spain as a symbol of a new Bourbon alliance, full of youthful hope. But Ferdinand's brutality quickly crushed her spirit. When she failed to produce a living heir, rumors flared that he had poisoned her. Though official histories claimed she died of tuberculosis, suspicious minds whispered that Ferdinand's twisted rage had driven her to her grave. His second wife, Maria Isabel of Portugal, fared no better. She gave birth to a daughter, but died during a subsequent childbirth, leaving Ferdinand once more childless. The tragedy only fueled his mania, and he surrounded himself with charlatans and quack doctors who promised him potions, prayers, and even magical rites to guarantee a son. Ferdinand was known to lock away any woman who refused his sexual advances, whether servant or noble, while priests looked the other way, fearing his wrath if they dared intervene. The Spanish court began to resemble a Gothic nightmare. Flickering candles cast monstrous shadows across marble corridors, while servants scurried through the palace in terror, careful never to catch their king's eye. Women whispered prayers against curses, fearing that one misstep would make them Ferdinand's next victim. Meanwhile, the people of Spain starved. Wars had shattered the economy, harvests failed, and famine swept the countryside. But Ferdinand cared little. His focus was on rooting out conspiracies and gratifying his twisted hungers. It is difficult for historians to know exactly how far Ferdinand's perversities reached. Official documents were sanitized, scrubbed of any mention of his more repulsive acts. But hidden diaries, letters smuggled out of the palace, and later liberal historians built a ghastly portrait. A king who demanded to watch the humiliations of prisoners, who forced his lovers to dress as children, who reveled in the power of fear itself. Even members of his own family were not safe from his venom. He distrusted his brothers and cousins so deeply that he spied on them through secret networks of guards, intercepting letters and monitoring their movements like a man possessed. Yet this tyranny was not absolute forever. In 1820, a group of military officers and liberals launched a rebellion, forcing Ferdinand to accept once again the Constitution of 1812. For 3 brief years, the so-called liberal triennium Spain tasted a fragile freedom. Newspapers reopened, exiles returned, and a cautious sense of hope flickered to life among the people. Ferdinand, of course, seethed at this humiliating constraint on his power. He signed the new constitution with poison in his heart, vowing revenge on those who had dared to chain him. And so, Ferdinand plotted just as he had plotted against his own father. He appealed in secret to the European reactionary powers, the so-called Holy Alliance, whose mission was to crush revolutions and restore absolute monarchies. By 1823, French troops, the ironically named 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, invaded Spain, toppling the liberal government and freeing Ferdinand to rule without limits once more. He returned to power with a cold, triumphant smile, ready to mete out punishments. Thousands were executed, their blood staining the stones of Madrid. Others were sent to die slowly in foul prisons. Ferdinand walked among the corpses as if they were trophies, a conqueror who had proven that no constitution, no law, no ideal of freedom could restrain him. The liberal dream was crushed under the boot of a king who saw every hint of independence as a personal betrayal. By the 1820s, Ferdinand VII was a king at war with his own humanity. Every day he tightened his grip on Spain, smothering any breath of dissent, while behind the palace walls he surrendered more and more to monstrous compulsions. His spies scoured the nation for subversives, filling the dungeons with poets, priests, soldiers, and even children, all suspects of liberal poison. The Inquisition, like tribunals, returned, painting freedom as a sickness and Ferdinand as the only cure. Yet even as he played the iron-fisted tyrant, Ferdinand's private world was a carnival of humiliations and horrors. Obsessed with fathering a male heir, he entered into marriage after marriage, each one more desperate than the last. His third wife, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, was barely 17 when she arrived in Madrid, a porcelain doll of a girl with soft manners and terrified eyes. Ferdinand's brutish appetites and violent tantrums destroyed her. She miscarried again and again, her health steadily collapsing under the strain of forced pregnancies and public scorn. At court, rumors grew that Ferdinand took perverse pleasure in shaming his queens if they could not produce a son. He would order doctors to parade their medical verdicts before assembled nobles, humiliating the women as failures. The same Ferdinand who signed death warrants without hesitation seemed to delight in the ritualized torment of these young brides, as though their pain affirmed his divine right to rule. The court became a grotesque theater of submission with Ferdinand as both ringmaster and predator. Beyond the palace gates, the common people suffered in equal measure. Wars had bankrupted the kingdom, leaving peasants to starve while Ferdinand squandered the royal treasury on gilded palaces and pleasure gardens. The price of grain soared beyond the reach of many families, and yet the king's agents still demanded taxes, dragging away farmers in chains for defaulting. Priests, many corrupted by Ferdinand's favor, thundered that famine was God's punishment for disobedience, a convenient justification that left the king's own abuses conveniently unchallenged. In 1829, Ferdinand made what would become his final marriage to Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. She was young, intelligent, and ambitious, hoping to soften the king's cruelty and perhaps secure a more stable future for Spain. But Ferdinand's nature could not change. His health was already faltering, his face bloated and discolored from excess and neglect, his legs riddled with ulcers. Still, he insisted on nightly inspections of Maria Cristina, commanding physicians to record every sign of fertility as if she were livestock. Against all odds, Maria Cristina conceived. In 1830, she gave birth to a daughter, Isabella, who would one day become Queen Isabella II. The arrival of a child seemed to briefly calm Ferdinand's fears, but it also ignited a new crisis. His brother, Don Carlos, had long expected to inherit the throne, and many traditionalists refused to accept a female monarch. Ferdinand, eager to protect his own bloodline, issued the Pragmatic Sanction, changing the succession laws so his daughter could inherit. This decree set off a storm of fury that would boil over into civil war after Ferdinand's death, but the king barely noticed. He had grown grotesquely obese, his breath reeking of infected gums and brandy, and his mind was clouded by pain and paranoia. He clung to Maria Cristina, alternately weeping and raging at her, convinced everyone, even her, was conspiring to steal the throne from his child. The court described him as a shambling, foul-smelling ghost, dragging his ulcerated legs through the royal apartments like some monstrous specter of Spain's failed absolutism. In those final months, Ferdinand's perversions took on an almost ritual quality. He forced his wife to kneel before him, to swear loyalty not only as queen but as a mother who would defend Isabella's rights. Some claimed he made her vow on holy relics while weeping with terror, others that he forced her to recite humiliating prayers. Whether these stories are literal or exaggerated, they capture the essence of a broken king who could only feel secure by crushing those around him. Outside, the Spanish people watched in sullen misery. Their country was exhausted, drained of hope, its future mortgaged to the whims of a madman. Ferdinand had destroyed the liberal movements, turned neighbors against each other, corrupted the church, and shattered the treasury, all while squandering years of peace that could have rebuilt the realm. His reign left Spain smoldering, a kingdom hollowed out by cruelty, fear, and his monstrous lust. In September 1833, Ferdinand finally died, his bloated corpse stinking with disease, surrounded by priests and opportunists picking at the last scraps of his power. His daughter Isabella was proclaimed queen, but the kingdom he left her was a tinderbox ready to ignite. As his funeral bells tolled, many dared to hope the nightmare was over, though the shadow of his obsessions would poison Spain for years to come. The death of Ferdinand VII in 1833 was not the end of the nightmare, but merely its transformation. His bloated, diseased corpse was laid to rest in the royal pantheon at El Escorial, but no solemn ritual could bury the bitterness he had sown. As soon as the king exhaled his final foul breath, Spain trembled on the edge of an abyss. His final act, naming his daughter Isabella heir to the throne, shattered centuries of tradition and ignited a powder keg of rage among the Carlists, supporters of Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos, who claimed the crown by right of male inheritance. The First Carlist War began almost before the king's body was cold. It was a conflict soaked in vengeance and ideological hatred, pitting the defenders of Isabella's fragile regency, led by her mother Maria Cristina, against the partisans of Don Carlos, who saw themselves as champions of true Spanish values, betrayed by a perverted tyrant. Ferdinand's personal obsessions had ensured that even in death he continued to sow division. Spain was ripped in two, and brother fought against brother across dusty plains and crumbling villages. Maria Cristina, left to rule as regent for her young daughter, faced a torrent of conspiracies and hatred. She had suffered Ferdinand's humiliations for years, forced into the role of broodmare and puppet, and now found herself struggling to preserve the throne for Isabella. The court was a nest of knives, former Ferdinand loyalists, military commanders with grudges, aristocrats with dreams of power, all jostling for position. Maria Cristina, a survivor by nature, used every ounce of cunning she possessed to stay alive in this storm, but the stain of Ferdinand's monstrous legacy clung to her. Meanwhile, the Spanish people had no peace. The Carlist forces swept through the countryside, proclaiming Don Carlos the true king and demanding obedience in the name of God, country, and tradition. Villages that resisted were burned, suspected liberals were hanged from oak trees, and Isabella's supporters answered with equal brutality. All across the land, the echoes of Ferdinand's repression lived on in fresh blood and fresh terror. Ferdinand's former queens, especially Maria Cristina, became symbols of both suffering and suspicion. Some whispered that they had been complicit in his crimes, that they had stood silently by as he abused them and abused the nation. Others pitied them, seeing in their pale, trembling faces the true scale of Ferdinand's cruelty. Maria Josepha Amalia, who had died before Ferdinand's final years, was remembered as a tragic martyr, while Maria Cristina bore the burden of trying to save her daughter's inheritance from total collapse. Within the church and nobility, a frantic effort began to cleanse Ferdinand's reputation. Chroniclers were ordered to edit out the worst of his abuses, to portray him as a misunderstood defender of the throne, a bulwark against godless revolution. Priests offered masses for his soul, preaching sermons that whitewashed his reign into something noble. Official histories were rewritten, pages torn out, testimonies suppressed. Spain wanted to forget the royal pervert ever existed, to bury his humiliations alongside his rotting body. But the people could not so easily forget. Families shattered by Ferdinand's witch hunts and executions remembered too well. Liberals who had fled into exile returned to find their homeland traumatized and exhausted. Secret societies circulated pamphlets that spoke openly of Ferdinand's monstrous appetites, exposing the vile humiliations of his queens and his sadistic delight in watching executions. These stories spread, forbidden yet unstoppable, reminding all who would listen that their king had been no savior, but a predator. Spain's political wounds grew deeper with every passing year. Ferdinand had left behind no real institutions to guide a new age, only fear and suspicion. The Carlist War, which raged until 1840, claimed tens of thousands of lives. Isabella's legitimacy was always fragile, haunted by her father's grotesque obsession with a bloodline at any cost. And Ferdinand's legal manipulations, like the Pragmatic Sanction, ensured the issue of succession would divide Spain again and again for decades to come. Culturally, too, Ferdinand's reign left scars. The reimposed censorship had crushed Spanish letters and philosophy, turning universities into timid echo chambers afraid to challenge power. Artists and thinkers who might have rebuilt the nation were driven out, silenced, or executed. A deep cynicism settled on the Spanish spirit, a sense that no leader could ever be trusted, that every promise of progress was a lie. That wound, perhaps, was the greatest of Ferdinand's many crimes. As Maria Cristina fought to secure Isabella's future, she could not fully erase the terror she had endured. Chroniclers record moments when she would flinch if a servant approached too quickly, or burst into tears at the memory of Ferdinand's fits of rage. The nightmares of a queen, broken and brutalized, mirrored the nightmares of a country struggling to rise from decades of horror. After Ferdinand VII's death, Spain tried desperately to wash its hands of him, as if purging the name alone could cleanse the nation's wounds. Court historians were tasked with rewriting his reign into a tolerable myth. Ferdinand the Restorer, the savior of Catholic Spain, the patriarch who preserved monarchy. Yet behind this veil of official propaganda, the truth festered like a hidden infection. Across taverns, in hushed conversations, and in underground political clubs, the real stories survived. Stories of a monarch whose lust and cruelty had turned Spain into a waking nightmare. The liberal exiles who returned from Britain and France brought with them memories of freedom and fresh hope, but they also carried a rage that could not be quieted. These men, many of them former deputies of the Cortes of Cadiz, began to write pamphlets and memoirs, exposing the perversions that Ferdinand's court had worked so hard to bury. They told of the young queens forced to endure humiliating medical inspections, of palace spies watching their every move, of a bloated king who laughed at public executions while children starved outside the palace gates. They recounted stories of Ferdinand forcing confessions out of prisoners through torture, and of his twisted delight in the tears of the condemned. Such accounts were often dismissed as liberal exaggerations, but their consistency across multiple witnesses, preserved in smuggled letters and family records, made them impossible to fully deny. Ferdinand had ruled by fear, and even in death, the memory of that fear refused to die with him. Among the people, he became a sort of cautionary monster, a dark parable of what happens when absolute power is handed to a heart without mercy. Maria Cristina's regency fought hard to keep his memory controlled. She needed to preserve the Bourbon dynasty for Isabella, and the myth of Ferdinand as a pious monarch suited her fragile authority. Priests dutifully preached the official narrative, praising Ferdinand's defense of tradition, while artists were commissioned to paint him with kindly, dignified features, erasing the rotting gums, the ulcerated legs, and the mad, gluttonous eyes. But Spain was changing. The flow of liberal ideas, carried on the winds of revolution across Europe, was unstoppable. Even some aristocrats began to murmur that Ferdinand's brutal reign had been a sin against the Spanish soul. These critics pointed to the destroyed universities, the burned books, the lives shattered under his Inquisition-like police. They could not square such medieval barbarity with a world rapidly modernizing. For the common Spaniard, Ferdinand's reign left a poisonous inheritance of distrust. People no longer dared believe that kings were God's chosen guardians. Ferdinand had shattered that illusion by showing just how filthy and base a monarch could become. Peasants might still bow before royal processions, but behind their respectful faces burned a deep resentment, an unspoken vow never to let such a tyrant reign again unopposed. Stories of the royal pervert took on a life of their own. passed down like folk tales. Grandparents told their grandchildren of the king who watched the beatings of prisoners for pleasure, who abused his young wives with vile demands, who smothered Spain's hope and left it choking on blood and fear. These stories blended with older Spanish folklore, making Ferdinand seem almost demonic, a warning to future rulers that the people's patience had limits, even in the most traditional, priest-ridden corners of Castile or Aragon. By the 1840s, liberal reformers were trying to rebuild the nation that Ferdinand had torn apart. New constitutions were debated. Military juntas rose and fell, and the question of Isabella's legitimacy never fully vanished. Behind all of this turmoil lay the same poisonous legacy: Ferdinand's decision to place his personal obsessions above the welfare of his realm. The civil wars, the bankrupt coffers, the culture of betrayal, these were all his gifts to Spain. Maria Cristina herself lived long enough to see the seeds of Ferdinand's rule grow into tragic harvests. She had hoped to shield Isabella from the worst of the court's intrigues, but she could not protect her from a divided, cynical nation. Isabella, little more than a child when crowned, would grow up in a Spain where loyalty was a thin veil over rival hatreds, where generals and priests plotted in every corridor, and where liberal and reactionary forces prepared for decades of fresh bloodshed. Yet despite everything, Ferdinand's name never truly disappeared. For every official portrait, every carefully whitewashed biography, there were 100 whispered tales. His monstrous image, the man who violated every sacred bond, who devoured his nation's spirit as hungrily as he devoured his queen's, refused to vanish. Spain could try to forget, but Ferdinand was carved into its collective memory like a scar. In the centuries since Ferdinand VII gasped out his final wretched breath, historians have wrestled with how to tell the story of a monarch so depraved, so destructive, that even his own country tried to scrub him from its memory. Early accounts, often paid for by the Bourbon dynasty, praised him as a restorer of tradition, a narrative that suited a fragile monarchy desperate for stability. But independent scholars, sifting through private letters, hidden diaries, and state archives, have laid bare a far darker truth. Ferdinand VII was not merely a reactionary. He was a predator on the Spanish body politic, a tyrant whose personal perversions mirrored the violence he inflicted on an entire nation. His sadism, his voyeurism, his obsession with controlling the wombs of his wives, and his relish for public humiliation all point to a psychology twisted beyond simple autocracy. In modern terms, we might see in him the classic hallmarks of a paranoid narcissist, someone who drew power from degrading others, and who could only confirm his own worth through their terror. The damage he inflicted on Spain was incalculable. By tearing up the Constitution of 1812, he suffocated the first flowering of Spanish liberalism. By inviting foreign intervention, he humiliated the country and left it vulnerable to future instability. By prioritizing his own bloodline over any other measure of governance, he sowed the seeds of civil war. Ferdinand did not merely set Spain back a generation. He crippled its progress for nearly a century, plunging the nation again and again into cycles of reaction and revolution. Modern historians have also sought to understand how Ferdinand's monstrous personal behavior was enabled. It was not simply that he was a pervert in secret. His abuses flourished because an entire structure of power, priests, nobles, generals, stood ready to defend him so long as their own privileges were protected. The moral cowardice of the elites, the silence of those who might have spoken up, allowed Ferdinand's reign of terror to thrive. That complicity, perhaps, is as damning as the king's own crimes. Yet in the popular imagination, it is Ferdinand's perversions that still grip attention. Stories of his forced humiliations, his fetish for inspecting his wives, his twisted pleasure in executions, and his absolute contempt for human dignity have become cautionary fables, half remembered but never quite forgotten. In folk songs, in whispers, in the terrified jokes of soldiers and farmers alike, Ferdinand remains el pervertido real, the royal pervert Spain tried to bury. In a sense, this dark legend serves a purpose. It reminds Spaniards and, indeed, the world that monarchy without accountability can become monstrous, that a crown worn by a sadist is no protection against tyranny. For centuries, the Spanish people had been taught to bow before their sovereigns as God's chosen vessels. Ferdinand smashed that illusion so thoroughly that even the devout could not fully forgive him. He forced a reckoning with the idea of monarchy itself, a reckoning that shaped later liberal movements and republican ideals across the Iberian Peninsula. Today, portraits of Ferdinand VII hang in royal palaces and museums, showing a handsome, confident Bourbon king. But to stand before those paintings with the knowledge of what lay behind that carefully composed gaze is to feel a shiver of horror. Those eyes, captured in oil and gold leaf, once watched queens cry under forced examinations. Those hands signed death warrants on a whim. That mouth, now frozen in a faint, regal smirk, once spewed venom and commands that shattered an entire nation's hopes. Perhaps it is fitting that modern Spain has chosen to place Ferdinand on a sort of historical quarantine, remembered, but rarely honored. School textbooks mention his name briefly, summarizing him as a reactionary king who lost the empire's last hopes. Yet between the lines, the monstrous details still linger, refusing to die. The stories of abused queens, starved peasants, secret police, and a twisted lust for domination remain part of the Spanish cultural undercurrent, a warning passed from generation to generation. Even now, historians debate the precise boundary between myth and fact in Ferdinand's depravity. Did he truly revel in watching prisoners tortured? Did he really force noblemen to witness his sexual humiliations of the queens? The sources are fragmentary, biased, and often sensational. But their consistency and the sheer weight of rumor supported by enough evidence leaves little doubt that Ferdinand VII was among the most debased sovereigns ever to sit on a European throne. His legacy is both a cautionary tale and a nightmare. It shows what happens when a people place blind faith in a crown, when an entire society is too afraid to stand against cruelty, and when a leader's lust, whether for sex, power, or domination, is given no limit. Ferdinand's story, in all its horror, is not only a story of the past but a living warning about the dangers of absolute authority. Spain has tried, again and again, to forget its royal pervert. But history, like a wound poorly healed, has a way of reopening. And so Ferdinand VII remains there, lurking in the dark corners of the nation's memory, a rotting echo reminding every Spaniard of how close even the grandest dreams of freedom can come to ruin in the hands of a king who believed everything existed for his monstrous pleasure.